My name is Bob Workman. I'm the director here at the Ulrich Museum of Art, and I welcome you to this evening's panel discussion, a part of stocked contemporary art from the grocery aisles that we have on view at the Ulrich through Sunday, April 14th. So I'm sure you've all seen the show. Please tell your friends. We've got 2 more weeks to enjoy this great exhibition before we send it down to Scottsdale, and it starts its national tour. So very special time for all of us. And I particularly enjoy the golden glow in the room, and I wanted to thank David for the gold tie. Most of you may know David's from K-State, and Liz and I have far too much purple in our wardrobes, so great to see that. I have the privilege of thanking our sponsors this evening. Our exhibitions, I don't know if folks understand this, but all of the programming of the Ulrich is funded by generous individuals, corporations, foundations. We are supported from the state with our salaries, but what we do beyond that comes from you all, and it's something that is very important to us. So if you know folks at any of these folks, and we have Norma in the room, and if you know folks at these companies, thank them for their generosity, because it makes this all happen. The Lois G. Walls Foundation, Delta Dental, Spirit Aerosystems, Richard D. Smith and Sandra M. Langle, Louise Barron, John and Nancy Bramer, Norma Griever, and Keith and Georgia Stevens. They all contributed to make Stock happen, and it was Emily's brilliance that conceived of this, and her and Patricia's hard work with Amy and the whole crew that realized this project. So we're not quite done with Stocked programming. We still have 2 more great lectures ahead, but I now want to turn this over to Amy to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Bob. And yes, it has been a really exciting semester, and none of these things could have happened without very, very generous donors. So let's give them another hand. All right, but the program at hand this evening is Eat Here, Food Deserts in the 21st Century. Of course, our moderator this evening is no stranger to Wichita or Wichita State University. She is our own Dr. Emily Stamey. Emily is currently the curator of the Associate Curator of Art at the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art. And that is an organization that is a contemporary art museum in the truest of sense. They are uniting cutting-edge artists of today. Some of you may remember Tony Fayer, who has visited us. He has also been to SMOCA, with the hip-happening types of architecture and design, all linked together with edgy and sometimes really out there, I love this, public programming, including their own lit lounge, which is quite often sold out, and arm wrestling for art. Yes, yes, you must ask Emily about wrestling for art. The Stocked exhibition has truly been a tour de force, really utilizing her scholarly research of social themes in American art, and Lord knows she has even branched out from American artists. Our panelists all hail from this type of region, Kansas, and yes, we have someone across the border in Missouri. Each brings their own frontline, in the trenches experience, coupled with really strong research. Dr. Ballard Reich, giving them the good wave, is the Kansas Health Foundation Distinguished Chair in Strategic Communication. And if that wasn't enough, she's also professor in the Elliott School of Communications here at Wichita State University. As founder of the WSU Hunger Awareness Initiative, she and her team developed a 4-pillar model that can be replicated by college communities across the nation, and yes, I believe it's already in use by some other universities across the United States. In 2011, they organized the first WSU Hunger Awareness Day, which included a partnership with Numana, where meals were packaged for more than 21,000 Somali refugees. It happened with 170 volunteers in less than 2 hours. Now that's organization. Eugene Brown, Eugene, give them a wave, is a native of Kansas City and the Ivanhoe neighborhood. If you know Kansas City, then you might know the Ivanhoe neighborhood. And it is at the center core of an ever-changing metropolis in the Midwest. Eugene heads the Beans and Greens program, bringing healthy food choices to more urban neighborhoods. Good job.
Thank you.
Their program has had an impact of more than $1 million on the local economy and includes a dollar-for-dollar matching program to match purchases by SNAP users. So not only healthy choices, but reaching some of those that may not have those options usually. In addition, they operate the mobile market, the first of its kind in that city. And Eugene will tell us more about that tonight, I hope. And last but definitely not least, Dr. David Proctor. David also has a lengthy list of duties. He is director at the Center for Engagement and Community Development. He's also the director for the Institute for Civic Discourse and Democracy, both at Kansas State University. And although I doubt that there is much more additional time for David, he is also a full professor at Kansas State. His research is definitely more than appropriate for the breadbasket of the world, as he has worked since 1987 to develop and share communication strategies that help preserve and sustain rural communities. How perfect. In 2012, he was awarded a significant USDA Agriculture and Food Research Initiative grant for business strategies for new and existing rural grocery stores, and has even briefed the U.S. Senate caucus on the loss of grocery stores in rural communities, and that's the devastating impact that happens when those are lost. Well, with that, we've got a great panel. This evening, Emily's going to kick things off. As the evening goes, we invite the audience to participate with questions, and Emily has lots of questions of her own. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us.
All right, thank you all for coming. So we have to start with a few images of artwork, or I would feel, sort of very remiss in my duties here. So I'm going to do just a little bit of background. I apologize, I'm recognizing lots of familiar faces, and you've all heard me talk about this some already, so there's a little repeat information, a refresher course, if you will. And then we'll get on to the questions. As Amy said, we really want this to be a conversation tonight. So we will do like the open call for questions at the end, but if you have questions for these three fabulously smart people up here as we go, wave a hand and I will be watching, and we can sort of fold those in throughout the evening. So the historical anchor for this show is in the pop art that was being made in the late 50s and the early 60s. And one of the key features of this art was that it often featured grocery food items. So we've got, Warhol's famous Campbell's soup can, which we all know, but then we've also got, canned spaghetti. We've got Del Monte, I think that's asparagus there, Wishbone. And there are also brands that we recognize, that we know that are still around today. And what's interesting about the moment that the pop artists are working in that mid-century moment is it's this moment of huge revolution for how food is produced in this country and how food is purchased. So I have to look at my stats here to make sure I get them right. But at mid-century, there were 50 companies that basically controlled the market on mass-produced food. And they also accounted for 80% of the advertising in all media and 90% of the food advertising on television. So suddenly this moment where it's, these recognizable brand names, Coke, Pepsi, Campbell's, Del Monte, that are really controlling, the advertising market around food and the production of food. At the same time, between 1940 and 1960, supermarkets' percentage of total grocery sales increased from 24 to 70%. So people totally shifted the way that they were shopping for food. It went from going to the baker, the butcher, the greengrocer, to suddenly going to the supermarket. And that's the context that the pop artists are working in. This is an image from a show that was done in 1964 that featured all of that art and really honed in on the idea and the recognition that these artists were making food about grocery stores. So this is a gallery in New York that transformed itself to look like a grocery store and then stocked it with the artworks that represented those foods. So we've got Warhol there on the left. And then, his stacked soup cans, and those freezer big containers that you see on the right are full of little sculptures of food that had been made by the artists. These are images from a Life magazine article on the show. So for the exhibition that is up currently stocked, I wanted to look at and think about, well, what are artists making that has to do with grocery stores and food now? And many of them are still looking to that historic pop art as a starting point. So here we have Warhol's first 32 soup cans that he painted. There was one for each flavor of soup that was available on the market. And then on the right, we have paintings by Scott Blake that are it doesn't show it in the picture here, but they're the exact same size as Warhol's soup can paintings. There are 32 of them, so it's an homage to Warhol. But these are the barcodes off the packages of food that he purchases. Other artists who are also interested in these ideas of branding and marketing and packaging, paintings by Lewis Cameron on the left, the Pantone color swatches from a box of peanut M&Ms, and on the right, a painting that represents the ratio of gray to brown to white in a Hershey's bar wrapper. So this distillation of these brands that we know so well and that we sort of recognize them even without their name printed on them and even in abstracted form. But then there's a lot of works in the show that they sort of move beyond that formal investigation and they start to look at more social issues. So this is a few of the prints in Damien Hirst's series called The Last Supper. The format of each print comes from a pharmaceutical package. They're packages that are used for pills that are treating cancer and HIV and really chronic illnesses. And then they're coupled with the names of British comfort foods. So this kind of push and pull we have between, are we worried that our comfort foods are bad for us and they're going to give us heart disease because they're all full of good fatty wonderfulness and we'll need to take the pills? Or are we taking too many pills and too many chemicals and we should really just be moving back to cooking? All sorts of different issues that come up here. And then apropos of our conversation tonight, two artists that are looking even more specifically at the grocery store. So on the left, photos by Brian Ulrich, who was here and spoke just recently, of these massive sort of big box grocery stores and this sort of odd alienation that happens in them. And then on the right, a series from, or photos from a series which was actually made into a book by an artist named Julian Montague, who created a field guide to identifying lost grocery carts. So these are the carts that get displaced from their stores of origin and wind up in all sorts of different places. Most specifically, however, the place where he finds them the most are outside of housing projects. So they are displaced by people who don't have access to transportation and use them to get their groceries home. And tonight our topic of conversation is about people living in areas that we call food deserts. And these are places where it's even more difficult to get your food home than just wheeling it all the way home in a cart. And I have asked the panelists that we would start by them telling us, sort of in more anecdotal or personal form, how they came to have work that intersects with food. So Amy gave us their titles and where they're working and all of these things, but I wanted to know how they came to it. What gets them excited or makes them feel invested in working in the projects that they work on? And I think they collectively decided that, David, you were going to go first.
Okay. Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. This is just a wonderful venue, and I'm just very pleased to be here. My name is David Proctor. I am a little embarrassed by the introduction because I've got all kinds of titles, but I really don't have that much power actually at Kansas State University. But what happened is in 2006, Kansas State University created what's called the Center for Engagement and Community Development. And the reason that they did that was they said that we have this long history at K-State of being the land-grant university. And so there's all kinds of outreach in terms of agriculture. There's a little bit in family issues, but they wanted there to be more outreach from Kansas State, and so they felt like they needed a center, a portal to energize that outreach work. So the mission of my center is to connect the resources and the expertise of Kansas State University with the goals, needs, and dreams of Kansans and communities around Kansas. So we deal in all kinds of, just a whole variety of issues. So we opened our doors in 2006, and almost immediately we started receiving calls from and emails and letters from around the state, from rural communities around the state, and what they said was this. They said if Kansas State, if they could do one thing to help our town, our small town, it would be to help us preserve our grocery store. Because they were saying that when our grocery store closes, there are just a host of bad things that happen. Not the least of which is it's really sort of, it is almost a stake in the heart of that small town. And so we started to look into what this situation was. And we found that it was really pretty dire. That there are some tremendous challenges, difficult challenges that these small stores face in these rural communities. And so what we decided to do was to take it on, and we created what we call the Rural Grocery Initiative. And since 2007, we have been working in this initiative with 4 goals. Number one, we're trying to understand what are the challenges that are being faced by these small rural grocery stores across Kansas. Number two, we are trying to develop some responses to those challenges to try and help ameliorate those challenges the best we can. Number three, we are looking for sustainable business operation models for these small grocery stores. And what we've come to believe is that there are multiple models out there that are, and depending on the community, some fit much better than others. And then finally, what we found was that there was no sort of cohesive network of these store owners across the state. And so our 4th goal then was to build both a virtual and a face-to-face network for these store owners to provide them with greater access to information and resources that are coming from Kansas State University and also other statewide resources that are relevant in the state of Kansas. So I'll stop there, but that's how I got into it.
Okay, Eugene, how about you go next?
Oh, okay. Well, again, my name is Eugene Brown. I work with the Kansas City Beans and Greens program. There's actually about 3 of us that run this program. We got started in 2010 when my executive director, who spent a lot of time in Boston, was actually there visiting the farmers market. And she noticed that a lot of the patrons had what appeared to be a coin, and it was somewhat of a voucher system. And so ultimately a lot of the shoppers were receiving assistance so that they could afford the healthier items, the healthier options. And so in 2010, we actually launched a very similar program in Kansas City where if someone was receiving SNAP or if somebody had food stamps and they wanted to eat local, healthier items, then they could go to any of the 7 existing farmers markets and actually purchase more food for their dollar. So rather than spending $50 for beef and anything from cabbage to bell peppers, they would only spend $25. Now, I came about in the end of 2010 when they said, hey, we kind of have an idea. We noticed that a lot of people have some enthusiasm around our program, but yet they can't get to farmers markets. Can you help us build a truck somehow that will take it to these neighborhoods and these communities that do not have grocery stores or farmers markets? And so ultimately in 2010, I helped build the mobile market. Everything that it is lives and breathes. I live about 7 days a week, most of the year. And so what we do is we take this 14-foot refrigerated box truck, 4 canopies, 2 freezers, anywhere from 20 to 30 different types of produce and fruits. And we go to grocery stores, we go to community centers, daycares, and we'll set up for 4 or 5 hours and make it available to those communities that don't have grocery stores at their own farmers markets. Now, it's a challenge because some days you have storms and you have wind and you lose a canopy and you chase it half a block downhill. Real life story. But it's something I'm very passionate about. And how I got to this, it sounds insane, but I'll have to admit this. In 2001, when I finally moved out on my own from my parents' house, I said, you know what? In order to be an eligible bachelor, you really have to, be able to cook. And so I took it upon myself to learn how to cook, which I was absolutely the worst at the time. And if you visited Kansas City before, you know we have a great downtown, and in the middle of that is our city market, which has been around for over 100 years. And I lived within walking distance, and I took it upon myself one weekend to go down and buy some ingredients because I had a big date planned. And from there, I noticed the freshness of the food. As Emily mentioned, I grew up in Ivanhoe neighborhood, which is in smack dab in the middle of Kansas City, and one of the worst neighborhoods to grow up in from a resource perspective, obviously from a crime perspective as well. And so that wasn't a part of my regular diet, even though I had a family member that worked in the restaurant industry. And so over the course of the years, I really became good at cooking. I have a girlfriend in the back that can vouch for that. What happened in 2007, I finally got my own land and I started gardening. In 2010, the summer before I joined Beans and Greens, my girlfriend said, hey, I know this program that just lost a job mentor in the agricultural area. Can you help them out? I was like, well, okay, I'll help them out. And so I began my life in agriculture, or at least in this part of agriculture, by mentoring youth that were anywhere from 12 to 15, helping them harvest 15,000 square feet of crops and operating their own youth market. And so from there, I joined the Beans and Greens team.
I'm Deborah Ballard-Reich, and I'm also delighted to be here. I got into the food space in kind of an odd way. How many of you are familiar with New Manna out of El Dorado? Well, in 2009, a vision that Rick McNary had to help people, empower people to feed the starving, started to come to fruition. And I had some friends who contacted me and said, wow, these people have never written press releases. They're trying to do articles for newspapers. Would you mind looking at their stuff? And I got hooked on Rick's vision. And his vision had to do with feeding school children. The idea being based on some work that George McGovern and Bob Dole had done that argued that the best way to fight poverty was to educate kids. And the best way to feed hungry people was to feed hungry kids in school. And that way you kind of got double bang for your buck. Well, the last weekend of 2009, New Manna held their first food packaging event in El Dorado, Kansas. And I, my daughter, her youth group, 8 of my grad students, because I take them everywhere, and a bunch of my friends went, and we were part of the 4,000 people who that weekend packaged 285,000 meals that were going to be trucked across the country and then boated to Haiti to go to Salvation Army schools and feed kids. Well, as you all know, January 12th, 2010, something else happened. The earthquake hit Haiti. And our food became some of the first food to reach Haiti. It was actually airlifted in by the United States Army. And I was hooked. Rick called me and said, so do you think WSU can do a million meal event? And I went, well, I don't know. So I called the president and the provost and I said, hey, can we do this? And within a half hour, not only were we doing it, I was running it. Be careful of the questions that you ask. I went back to my building and I grabbed Elliott Hall right across the way. I grabbed my grad students and I said, I think I may have just lost my mind. I'm jumping off a really big cliff and I would like you to come with me. And to their benefit, all of them said yes. And within 3 weeks, we planned WSU Feeds Haiti. Over 3,000 people came to the Hughes Metroplex and packaged over 641,000 meals. I was jazzed. Don't do that on Super Bowl weekend, though. There was a logic problem in my thinking there, but that's what I tried. And then that spring, we had the first Kansas Hunger Dialogue, and New Manna and Universities Fighting World Hunger came together and thought, let's bring the universities in Kansas together. We've already got this wonderful grassroots, community-based stuff happening. What if we got the colleges and universities involved? And at that summit, one of the questions that arose was about hunger on campus. And, we've all heard the myth of the starving college student and all of that. Well, we didn't have any data, and we couldn't find any data to indicate if that was actually accurate or not. So for the last 2 years, I've been chairing an initiative that started in a health communication course that I taught on hunger to raise awareness about hunger on our campus and also to unpack the nature and scope of hunger on our campus. And through those last 2 years, we've developed an amazing 4-pillar model that we've presented at international, national, regional conferences that we've taken on the road to various colleges and universities that involve collaborators, media, academic research, and events. And we've learned a lot. And one of the things that I learned that I didn't expect, because sometimes we don't see what's right in front of our faces, is that there is a problem with hunger on campuses. There is a problem with hunger for college students. One quick side note, we did a food drive for the Kansas Food Bank this last October, and our goal was to collect 5,000 pounds of food campus-wide in 2 weeks. And that seemed to be reasonable. And I started to notice this really odd thing. I would leave my building at night, and at night, the bin in front of our office would be about 3/4 of the way full. And I would come back the next morning, and it would be about 1/4 of the way full. And then the dorms would call us and say, come and pick up the food, the bins are overflowing. And we would get there to pick up the food, and the bins would be about half full. And it took us 3 weeks, forest for the trees, to realize what was happening is that hungry students, hungry staff were taking food out of the Kansas food bank bins. So I'm still learning, and I'm learning to see the trees in front of my face. But my take on food deserts at the moment has to do with issues that impact students and staff members on campuses' abilities to have access to healthy food.
Okay, so I thought we would start with this term food deserts, because as I'm doing my research and getting ready for you guys to be here, it's defined in all these different ways. So, the USDA defines it one way and another policy organization defines it another. What are the working definitions that the three of you use, either with the people that you're working with or in your own research, to define what a food desert is?
Ours is probably most atypical because I didn't come to this from the direction anyone else did. My research is as a social scientist and as a communication scholar. So what we focus on is the notion of access and availability of food. There are a lot of structural definitions of food deserts. How far is a location from a functioning grocery store that offers healthy food? We've become aware of a lot of structural barriers that make it difficult for people to get food when it may actually be available at some times. So food deserts for us have to do with the lack of access and availability of healthy food.
So we come at it from the rural perspective, and food deserts, when they were first sort of conceptualized, they were talked about in urban contexts. But there are conceptualizations of the rural piece, and the way that it, and this is a more formal kind of definition, it does come from USDA, but they look at census tracts, rural census tracts. And they say that if 20% of the folks that are living in that census tract are below the poverty level, and if 1/3 of that census tract lives more than 10 miles from a supermarket, then they're considered living in a rural food desert. And when I talk about this to groups, oftentimes people sort of smile and laugh a little bit, because for rural people, I mean, you get out in northwest Kansas, 10 miles is not much. However, that's why the poverty piece is so important, because when you start looking at it from that perspective, transportation becomes a very significant issue. The other thing that I always remind folks when I talk about rural food deserts is that in rural parts of the state there are significant elderly population, and again. You get to a point where you don't want your mom or your dad or your grandfather or grandmother driving 30 miles one way to buy groceries. And so again, transportation becomes an issue. And so it is poverty and lack of access, and 10 miles is what they talk about in rural.
Now, 10 miles in Kansas City would be just unthinkable. So for us, from an urban perspective, typically we look at food deserts to be anywhere from 1 mile to 2 miles. We also look for other components like non-existent or reduced public transit. For example, 2 of the markets we serve, if you live in those communities on Saturday or Sunday, you cannot catch a ride out of the town unless you have your own vehicle. So if you are, to Dave's point, if you're somebody that lives in the senior high-rise and you cannot get a ride, then what are you going to do for food? And a lot of those families, unfortunately, they buy in smaller quantities, so they buy more frequently. But the other thing that we look at from a food desert perspective, it's not just about distance and access from a transportation perspective, but it's also from a cost perspective. We have one of the best organic farmers markets in Brookside, Kansas City, and it's but a hop on the bus from most of the urban core that live in below poverty line areas, but they don't shop there because they can't afford it. So when we look at things that we do, such as the matching program and where we decide to make them available, for example, at the Brookside Market, we do make it available. We're hoping to eliminate one of those barriers, kind of like auto insurance. How many times have you heard about an uninsured motorist hitting someone? Well, it's not because people prefer to go with uninsured cars, it's just that they can't afford it. So in our situation, what we try and do is help minimize the cost impact so that people can experience the benefit of healthy options.
So building on that, so we've defined the food deserts, and then, as we've been talking, you've all, and this is prior to all of us getting here in the room, we spent the afternoon together, talking about a number of the problems that come out of the food desert, and not just it's hard to get food. I mean, that's the obvious problem, but then there are all of these other nutritional and economic and community-based problems that evolve. So I wonder if you could each speak to that a little bit.
Well, I'll jump on it. It's interesting. It's I do a lot of work with the Greater Kansas City Food Policy Coalition. We do everything from we work on everything from changing policy regarding having chickens in your backyard in the urban core to being able to sell produce if you happen to live on the plot, which, by the way, you can't do that in Kansas City, so don't try. The thing that's interesting that we've run into is that there is this hot topic debate about food deserts and what actually qualifies. So one of the things that we like to talk about is the impact, bless you, of corner stores. Corner stores will sell everything from Doritos to Pops to energy drinks, all the things you really shouldn't buy. All the stuff that we eat when we're on the road driving to Wichita. So one of the things that we've noticed, and there are a lot of studies that come out recently that will support it and at the same time present some additional points of thought, is that if you live in these urban cores, one, if you are limited in transportation, two, affected from an economic standpoint, you're more likely to be obese and have some of these other health issues such as high blood pressure, hypertension, all these other things, because typically the choices that you will fall back to are the corner stores. An issue that we face with some of our market being as successful as we want, while we are presenting healthier options and we're even offering, if you will, a price break for those that may need it, we find that a lot of families and communities still, with a lot of family members and households within our markets, still take that pilgrimage to other communities. So for example, if there's a Hispanic family, Latino family in Argentine, they're used to driving 3 miles to Rosedale Park because there's a Walmart and there's a Price Chopper and there's the hair salon place and the liquor store and the game store and everything else. And so while we present options, they have started to fall into a different routine because they lived in food deserts so long that for me, it doesn't make sense for my family to buy produce from you once or twice a week. I'll just wait till I go to a store and I'll buy regional produce or no produce at all because those options don't exist. So those are some of the concerns that we start to see. And those are habits that have been formed over years, and a lot of them are based on financial.
Yeah, there are very significant impacts of food deserts in rural parts of the state. I want to start, though, by sort of giving you some statistics on the scope of the problem of food deserts in rural Kansas. There are 105 counties in Kansas. 40% of those counties, the majority of those counties, are rated as food deserts. There are 675 incorporated cities and towns in Kansas. 51% of those cities and towns do not have a grocery store in them. Since 2007, 87 small grocery stores, and now the work that we're doing is looking at communities of 3,000 people or less. 87 of those stores have closed their doors. And we began with a population of those stores of 215. Now, some of those have reopened, but a lot have not. So the scope of the problem is significant first. But then the way that we talk about impacts of food deserts, we talk about them in 3 ways. We say, first of all, picking up on what Eugene was talking about from a nutrition point of view, that and research, it seems sort of counterintuitive, but research indicates that across the United States, obesity is more of an issue in rural parts of the country than it is in urban parts of the country. And they've found that when grocery stores are present, there's this inverse relationship in rural communities. So as number of grocery stores go up, obesity goes down. The other thing about like in rural communities, if there's no grocery store and you're looking for some kind of food, immediately, you really have about 2 choices. You have the gas station and you have the convenience store. And neither of those places offer a whole lot of healthy food. I mean, there's a little bit, but not very much. So one, we talk about impacts in terms of nutrition and health. The second way we talk about the impacts of food deserts in rural Kansas is through the economics. And what we find is we've done research that indicates that these small grocery stores average 15 employees, part-time, full-time employees, which makes them one of the larger employers in the town. So that when the store closes, I mean, you're losing, incredibly, you're losing one of the primary employers in town. It's also significant in terms of the tax base. We did another study of rural grocery stores across Kansas, and what we found is that in terms of sales tax for that community, the grocery store provides 20% of that pie. So again, when those stores close, you're losing a very significant piece of the sales tax that helps maintain the town. And then finally, we talk about the grocery store as a community builder. It is a place where people meet one another. It is a place where you sort of learn how to kids learn how to act in public. It is a place where sort of this idea of social capital is built. And so for those three reasons, sort of health, the economy, and then also this community building piece, these grocery stores are tremendously important.
I won't talk about the physical parts because we already hit on that a bit: high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes. What we found that surprised us a bit is the psychological impacts of hunger or food insecurity. And food insecurity is a little bit different, although I think it's very related to what we're talking about. It's such things as not knowing where your next meal is going to come from, not knowing if you have the capacity to afford your next meal, not knowing if you're going to be able to pay rent or eat this month or get your medicine or eat this month. And those kinds of issues have a significant impact on people's well-being. We know that poor nutrition affects children's ability to learn. It makes it harder for them to learn. We know that the lack of availability of food requires people to make trade-offs in their lives that are significant stressors. So we focus predominantly on the kind of the personal, psychological, emotional impacts of food insecurity in our work to this point.
So now, knowing how dire these problems are that we're dealing with, I promise this wouldn't be a total downer of an evening. So the good news is that there are lots of programs out that are trying to do something about this, and all of these different models, and each of these people is working with one. So I wonder, you could maybe talk a bit more about what your programs are doing, but then other models that you've seen or finding interesting that are out there in the country for how we deal with this problem of food deserts.
My favorite, absolutely favorite model is New Manna, and what they're doing in El Dorado is incredible. Several years ago, Rick McNary discovered that there was concern on the part of, I love this, Homeland Security on the safety of the food supply. And so they have discussed at least and are starting to put some money into the notion of creating locally sustainable food sources. And El Dorado, Kansas has been working on this for a couple years as kind of a model location. They're partnering with Ag at K-State. They've got community gardens, and their models of community gardens involve things like, renting your own little plot and building your own, and working in a community part of the garden so that you'll have some payback in terms of fresh fruits and vegetables when they're ripe. And also the idea of building, and I don't know if they've done this piece of it yet, there was a little bit of blowback from this from the Farmers Market Association in Kansas, but to then take the produce from these community gardens and sell them more economically locally. They also recognize that that only works during the time of the year when, food is ripe. And so they started to work with K-State to develop a model that worked on the entire life cycle of food, so that you take the food that you have available. If there's excess, you teach people how to can it and how to pickle it and that sort of thing, so that you create, at least theoretically, a soup to nuts full life cycle plan for sustainable food in your community. I'm not sure how far El Dorado's gotten on this, but I have seen their models, and I think that's a brilliant model. That's my favorite model at this point. And I think we could replicate that in neighborhoods, if nothing else, in Wichita.
One of the things I said, one of the goals of our initiative is we've searched around for different models of rural grocery operation. And we found some really innovative ways that communities are running grocery stores. And I want to talk about one in depth and then just mention another couple. We have found several stores, not any in Kansas, although we're encouraging communities in Kansas, but in other states, where the high school runs the grocery store. I mean, they literally run the grocery store, and it's not being run out of Mrs. Jones' fifth grade room. They have a physical structure that they are they are fully in charge of stocking the grocery store, doing all the ordering, doing all the inventory, pricing, selling, and we just think that this is such. It is not a model for every place, but it is such an interesting, cool model. And we think that one of the things that is most interesting about it is, and we're doing research on this right now, but we believe that by having students sort of be just integrated into the operation of this business that is vital to their town, that it is likely to make them more positive and more likely at some point in their life to return to that small community. So I just think that's the coolest model. But in terms of sort of an overall finding, we're finding more and more communities are that the public and the private are partnering somehow. There are communities, in fact, in Kansas where the local city government has set partnerships to establish and sustain grocery stores, and that public-private looks in a variety of ways. There are community-owned stores. There are partnerships between some form of government and a private entrepreneur. But we're seeing more of those kinds of operations all the time, and I think that gives hope for rural food deserts.
So I'll give a few facts about what we've done in the program. And some of this was foreign to me because it wasn't a part of my world. But if you lived in Kansas City in 2009, and let's just say you were dependent upon food stamps at the time to buy and provide for your family, there were only 2 farmers markets you could go to in the entire metropolitan area. Now, to put that in perspective, obviously our population is a little bit bigger than Wichita. Now, that was kind of insane to think about. But at the time that the program was introduced in 2010, in 2009, food stamps only accounted for about $7,000 worth of purchases at those farmers markets. So when you think about that, all that money goes back to typically local farmers. So local farmers were coming to the biggest city market in the region, and they were only getting $7,000 a year. Well, we introduced the matching program in June of 2010, and from June of 2010 to December, $53,000 in purchases were made at the farmers markets. Now, that was just a small pool. That was just the beginning. In 2011, we did $116,000 in matching funds. So you saw the local farmer, or the pool of local farmers who are participating at these farmers markets, get maybe collectively $7,000, $8,000 to over $100,000 a year. And the same thing happened in 2012. We did almost $120,000. And if you use the USDA's multiplier impact, that's how we understand that we do over $1 million worth of impact to the local economy. Now, that's been fantastic, which we are going to repeat again for this year. Going into our 4th season, we've already budgeted over $100,000 for matches. So that's an awesome thing. That's something that we are proud of. From a mobile market perspective, last year we purchased from local farmers over $22,000 in local produce to make available at the 10 different communities that we went to. So in a sense of what we're trying to do, it's not just about decreasing the price barrier, but it's also bringing it to the neighborhoods and communities. So that's a little bit about what we do. I mean, obviously the local farmers really enjoy it. To put other things in perspective, last year alone we touched over 18,000 families. Reason being is with our tracking, we're able to tell how many people use the cards. Now that's 18,000 people that actually went to a location specifically to buy local produce, local meats or eggs, things of that nature. And so that's something that we're very proud of. Obviously the local economy, the local farmers are very pleased to participate in the program. So that's something that we're proud of.
Thank you. In the back, I was just saying, no one's asked a question yet, so now I'm going to formally turn it over to all of you to ask some questions. So, yeah, Dale.
I'm curious as to how the Kansas Food Bank process works, that program, and how it incorporates into the community, and also the faith-based communities that provide food. I don't know if that's part of this discussion or not, but it is a food providing program, and I don't know exactly how that functions, like the Kansas Food Bank. Where does that food come from and where does it go?
I cannot speak to that directly, but in terms of the broader question, another thing that we are doing in 5 communities across Kansas is we are holding what we're calling FEAST events. And FEAST is an acronym that stands for Food, Education, Agriculture, Solutions Together. Essentially, it is a community-wide conversation about food access. And what comes out of it is a strategic plan around food access. And so you mentioned faith-based, for example, and so one of the things that comes out of these conversations is all of the different ways to strengthen the local food system. That would include working with faith-based operations, working with local growers, working with farmers markets, working with the local grocery store. So charting out a number of strategic actions to build the local food system. And so we have done our first one, which was in Doniphan County, northeast Kansas. We're getting ready to do one in Republic County, a really little town up there called Cuba, Kansas. We're going to be in Sedan, Kansas. We're going to be in Mineola, Kansas, and we're going to be in Smith Center, Kansas. And each of these are going to be these community-wide feast events that are going to explore this kind of thing that you're raising.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I can tell you this was a learning experience. Part of what we do, we try not to waste any produce. When I say we run a mobile grocery store and we're running 6 and 7 days a week, what you have to understand is that we will not sell produce that we've had more than 48, 72 hours because we realize the healthy value of that. Second of all, if we have it at the end of that time, we typically donate it to some organizations. Hope Faith Ministries serves over 40,000 homeless people in Kansas City. We donate our produce there every Sunday. We also work with Guadalupe Center, which is another nonprofit in Kansas City that serves another community. And so what we've learned in working with harvesters, the Episcopal Church, a lot of different organizations is that the same people that participate or take advantage of the food banks are also our customers. It is a cycle that goes on a monthly basis. A lot of the people that are relying upon SNAP, believe it or not, that doesn't carry them through the entire month. So a lot of times what you'll see is that the SNAP purchases tend to be very high the first and second week of the month, and by the third and the fourth week of the month, then they're visiting the food banks, and then they're going to harvesters. So I know from our perspective, we donate tons of food on a weekly basis, and at the same time, the same people that we see at harvesters or at the food banks, they're some of our customers earlier in the month.
I was wondering if you could comment on, since the early 20th century, you had land-grant colleges in the U.S. Department of Agriculture encouraging larger and larger farms, leading to a decrease in rural population, and then monoculture as well. And if the USDA is encouraging these kinds of economies of scale, how can we really overcome any of the problems you're talking about, which discourage small farms and the diversity of food?
We don't have the Dean of Agriculture in here, do we? I mean, you raise a great question. And certainly Kansas State University has a very strong relationship with commodity farmers. I've also, but one thing that's encouraging to me is that over the past year, Kansas State University, specifically the College of Agriculture, has reached out and is now sort of in regular conversation with the Kansas Rural Center. And if you're familiar with those folks, they are all about local growers, small farmers, supporting farmers that are growing fruits, vegetables, nuts, those kinds of things. And so I think that I don't think Kansas State is going to move away from commodity farming, but they are, I think, expanding and talking more explicitly with the small and medium-sized farms as well.
I think it's important to realize, too, that there are more departments in the government than ag. And I think one of the biggest things that will change this is Homeland Security and their effort on making sure that our food system is secure. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the average piece of food on your table at dinner at night has traveled 1,500 miles to get there, regardless of whether it was grown in Kansas first. Now, that's not obviously if it comes from a food market, but Homeland Security has decided that this is a threat to our nation, and so they're putting efforts toward encouraging sustainable local food sources. So I think that while ag has had a tradition over the last several decades that lead us in one direction, there are competing interests now as well in the federal government that will provide funding and are interested in supporting more sustainable local food as well.
I just want to make a comment. I'm very encouraged to hear about the use of high school students in running the grocery stores. I think in solving any problem, and especially this one, it's just profound to bring young people into the activity, to give them purpose in life, to give them an opportunity to feel that they have control over their lives, to give themselves a sense of worth and respect, because they are providing for others. And in much of our society, we've lost this. And I think some of our psychological losses are as great as food. I mean, it's right, we do not live by bread alone, but I'm not saying that that isn't critical and urgent. It's also people have to be fed before they can think about morality. But to bring the community into the solution of the problem, especially young people, I think is the most fruitful way to go, because you are solving many problems at once. And if we could return to gardening and canning and doing that activity, which many of us did in our youth, I think we could help people along in solving some of the problem.
I totally agree with what you're saying. On even-numbered years, we host a rural grocery conference at Kansas State University, and this past June, 2012, we brought a school-based grocery store. We brought students and their advisors from a small town just outside of Warrensburg, Missouri. We brought an advisor and a student from, I want to say it's Arnold, Nebraska. It's northwest Nebraska. And another one from a little bitty town in northwest Minnesota called Rothsay, Minnesota. And all three of those, well, the Nebraska one was actually created from 4-H. I mean, that's where the impetus came from. But the other two were strictly out of the high school, and they just were very inspiring stories that they told about what they were doing.
I think your point's really well taken, too, about building from a community base. And many of you may not be aware of this, but the first weekend in March, Kansas did something really unique. The public and private colleges and universities in the state came together and hosted the university's Fighting World Hunger Summit in Overland Park, Kansas. And one of the big tasks of that summit was not to hear about only wonderful programs like Eugene's and others, but to leave there with a plan of action. And 10 students from Wichita State now have plans of action for how they're going to impact their communities. There's research that indicates elementary school programs that teach kids about nutrition, right, teach them about nutrition, healthy eating, right, than we're allowing them to. Physical education. If you can empower fifth graders, who are really the leaders in elementary schools, to develop their own health promotion program around healthy eating and physical activity, you can make a significant difference in issues like healthy eating and obesity and those sorts of things. So that community-based empowerment piece, I think, is really very critical.
How much do you feel that the food industry itself has, number one, contributed to the demise of the small grocery store, and number two, contributed to the demise of nutrition in grocery stores because of processed food?
Let me answer the second question first. We are in...
Did everyone hear that question? David, can you repeat what you're...
the way that I understood the question was, how has the food industry contributed to the demise of sort of small town grocery stores or smaller grocery stores, and has the food industry contributed to the demise or to the demise of healthful eating? I want to answer the second question first, because we are just embarking on, I think, a really exciting project at K-State, and that is we are working with a national food distributor, a national food distribution company, to put together a profile for rural grocery stores about what sort of a mixture of healthy foods would look like. Because the idea is, from their perspective and from our perspective, the idea is that there needs to be a niche for people to shop locally. It can't just be another whatever grocery store, because they're going to drive, if they're able, they're going to drive to and buy at the town farther away. So we are putting together this profile right now, working with human nutritionists at K-State, and putting together this profile, and then we're going to chart to see what it does in terms of sales. I mean, do grocery sales increase? Do people actually buy these more healthful foods? So that gives me encouragement on the second question. The first one, I think one of the things, I think it probably has impacted sort of the demise of of small grocery stores. I think one of the other things, though, is one of the things I point to is that this culture that we have of, and I mentioned this when I first started, in rural parts of the state anyway, we have this sort of culture that it's no big deal to hop in the car and just go. And so there's that, and then there's also the piece, I think, of constantly looking for the cheapest price. And what we try and point out when we talk to rural communities is that if you take a longer view, while you may save some money immediately by purchasing at a big box store in a city, the long-term picture of your town and your investment in that town is being hurt if this store closes and then dominoes begin to fall in that rural community.
Can I add one thing real quick? So you said you don't want it to be all doom and gloom, because it sounds overwhelming at most, at the least, I should say. The interesting thing is that in Kansas City, I mentioned it earlier, the Greater Kansas City Food Policy Coalition, they're actually taking on this topic. If you're curious as to whether or not there is an impact from the food industry, next time you go to a farmer's market, ask how many of those farmers actually supply somebody in a commercial industry or a large chain restaurant. You're going to find very little. So I would say it's very impactful. One of the things that we've realized is that because of that, there's actually, Food Now is an organization in Kansas City that promotes it, as well as the Greater Food Policy Coalition. But the small mom and pop restaurant owners, and I'm not talking about the kind that don't get business, but I'm talking about the place that we all would want to be on a Friday or Saturday night. They have created kind of a coalition or association of restaurants that have committed to purchasing from local growers. So what you have started to see is that on a local level, when there is some awareness about the impact of the agricultural industry, we are making concerted efforts to make sure that we support our local growers.
Well, kind of where I'm coming from is, for example, a manufacturer, say, I hate to use a name, but say Kellogg's. They make cereal, okay? Well, go into a big store, there's millions of boxes of cereal, kinds of cereal. A small grocer can't do that. They don't have the space, they don't have the money. Not only that, but Kellogg's will probably, now I'm not saying that they do, but this is what I think, that they buy the whole line, give us the best shelf space, and whereas the small, healthy box of cereal is up there in the corner where you can't reach it.
Yeah. I know that feeling.
And that's where I think the food industry is kind of ruined a lot of a true good grocery store.
Can organize.
Amy, you had a question over here.
Each of you have had, so much of your work is about being in the trenches, making things happen, also research. And yet, what I think kind of got left out of the discussion is your need to really be finely attuned to the nature of each community. And each of you had earlier kind of chatted about specific instances. I'd love to hear about your strategies and understandings, surprises, as you met with different community members. Eugene, you listed off a diverse group of people that probably are a lot of volunteers as well, that you've got to keep coming together and working with. How do you manage that community building and understanding who the community is?
That's a great question. It seems ever challenging, I'll say that. But ultimately for us to be successful as an organization, as I mentioned, there's 3 of us and there's only 1 of us that works at the mobile market. So we go to communities, whether it's a school district, whether it's a church, whether it is the local housing authority, we actually go to those leaders and ask for core volunteers. So a lot of times you'll find residents, you'll find seniors, retirees, council people, you'll find commissioners, and they volunteer. The thing that's important, our success, the most successful markets that we've had are actually in the communities that resemble small towns. Marlboro community, where they're more tightly knit. So they're typically going to be, from an age perspective, they're your communities that have been around longer. They're your neighborhoods that have more historic value to them from a house perspective, from an organizational perspective. But those are the communities that typically care the most. And so they volunteer their hours and they volunteer their time because they understand the impact of healthy food, healthy eating. The ones that don't, it is a hard job. So we use small newspapers, we use small radio ads, we use flyers door to door. We can put a flyer in a daycare box for when a person picks up their kid, and unfortunately, sometimes it gets ignored in those communities, and so that's always a challenge, because what we find is that same community that could use the financial benefit of shopping with us, even the lower price or even the match, those are often the ones that ignore us. So that's the challenge there for us.
The critical piece to answer that question from our research is you have to figure out who the opinion leaders are in the community. You have to figure out who the trusted members of the community are that can vet you and let people know that you're safe and that you're okay and that you're committed and that it's okay to talk to you and it's okay to interact with you and that you really do care. One of the biggest mistakes that I think social scientist researchers can make is that we assume we know the answer. You know, we know that healthy food's the answer. So we tend to, have that tendency to helicopter in and tell people what they need to do in terms of eating healthy. Well, that doesn't work. What you need to do is figure out what the dynamics are of the individual community, who the opinion leaders are in that community, what the issues are in that community, and then tailor programming that's appropriate to those people and their needs if you want to be successful and have a sustainable impact. And we've seen that time and time again over all the different kinds of community-based research that we do. I work mostly with students in my initiative, and that's the first thing I teach them. We don't know the answers. We don't even necessarily know the questions. So when we started our Hunger Awareness Initiative, the first thing we did was create a website and ask people to share their hunger stories with us, because we didn't even assume we could frame the right questions. And then from there, we did focus groups where we asked some very general questions. And then finally, after we had done, we talked to 54 people shared their stories, 150 talked to us in dinner and conversation events that Sodexo sponsored for us. Then we said, okay, let's try our first survey. A lot of researchers hop to surveys first because they think they know the answers and they want quantitative data and they want the numbers now. If you're not asking the right questions, it doesn't make any difference if you have a survey. So grounding yourself in the community, finding the opinion leaders, finding the credible people who can be your allies and advocates within the community who are willing to say, whoa, Deborah, you are so off on this one. Don't approach it that way, is really critical to creating a partnership with a community in order to create sustainable change in this and, pretty much any area that I've worked with.
I just would echo that. We, as I said, one of the goals of the Rural Grocery Initiative is to identify and understand the challenges facing these stores. And so we've done a number of things to try and figure out, from the perspective of the store owners and people living in rural communities that are in food deserts, what are these challenges? And we've done that. We've actually done 2 surveys. We've done listening sessions at each of the conferences that we've held, where we have just time to listen to what these folks are telling us. It's really been a fascinating process. And we still continue to learn, but as we sort of understand more and more about these challenges and are able to talk about these challenges, we find that we collect different partners, because all of a sudden we're talking in ways that make sense to people that maybe we didn't even think about. And just one quick example, one of the primary challenges that rural grocery store owners face is energy costs. Again, if you've visited any sort of rural grocery stores, sometimes they're not in the best of buildings, and so roofs are bad, windows are bad, HVAC is bad, refrigeration is bad, and so we've been sort of talking about that, and then we received a call here not too long ago from the Energy Division of the Kansas Corporation Commission, and they said that they had heard about our work, and they were going to, over the next couple of years, they were going to focus their attention on bringing greater energy efficiencies to these rural grocery stores. And that call just came totally out of the blue to us, but they're now a partner with us, and we're super glad to be working with them.
I'm wondering where the K-State Extension Program stands. For a while, you had a fantastic program, and it's my understanding it's just about decimated.
I hope not. No. Extension is a wonderful partner for us. So that, for example, when we go to, I mentioned these feast events, the next one that we're going to do is in about 2 weeks, and it's in Republic County. And we have 2 of the extension agents have been central in putting that meeting together. We, in every county or every community that we're working in, if we're working significantly in that county, we are working also with the extension agent. Maybe what you're referring to and what is happening with extension is, for years and years and years and years, every county had extension agents. Because of funding kinds of issues, some areas of Kansas are now going to what they call extension districts, so that they are combining clusters of counties, and then extension agents will be responsible for those 3 counties instead of just 1 county. But I think actually, in terms of the big picture across the United States, Kansas Extension is really robust, and I think they do wonderful, wonderful work.
Time for 1 or 2 more. Yeah.
There's a health and wellness coalition here in Wichita, and one of the things that we're focused on is increasing access to and consumption of healthy foods. And so the discussion right now is how do we elevate that conversation in the community, but also is it important to have a food policy council of some kind, like we're doing now for the bicycle pedestrian side of things to address physical activity? Have you all had any experience with food policy councils? Where do they live? Are they with county government, city government, nonprofit? And what kinds of policies do they involve themselves with?
In Kansas City, I mentioned it a couple times earlier tonight, the Greater Kansas City Food Policy Coalition, Beth Lowe is the executive director. To answer your question logistically, it is its own standing organization, and initially, all of the work that was done by the Policy Coalition was by volunteer. Whether it was volunteers from the county departments, people like myself, K-State Extension, all of these people that are in the midst of this conversation about food security were all volunteering on some level. We've tackled policies from something as simple as making produce available to sell at your house or on your land if you live there, chickens. We're working on a program to introduce, as I mentioned earlier, local growers to institutions. So we're trying to get things like schools and government agencies to commit to not just buying from their larger suppliers or their agent that manages all that, but working with a local supplier. But ultimately, it was a core of volunteers.
Food councils tend to be in more urban areas, and so we have not had a lot of experience with food councils, although people tell me all the time, that they're this very positive vehicle for increasing awareness and access to healthy foods. But yeah, we've not done a lot.
We had one question over here I'm going to go to first, and then yours will be the last one.
Okay, my question is for you, Eugene. I work in an urban high school here, and I routinely see my students at lunch, for example, choose a bag of chips that they have to pay for over fruit that's free. So my question is, has your program, or are there programs that you know that have, in addition to changing availability, had success changing that
Habits.
corner store food mindset?
That habit is hard for us to, at least from a mobile market perspective, hard for us to really lay claim to. Jen Brockman, as I mentioned, is my counterpart. She has all of the data, but we did do a survey of the families that shopped at our farmers markets or at the mobile market, and we absolutely did see an increase in their consumption of fresh produce, fresh fruits. Not small, substantial, like 50% of your meals or amounts of quantity. So if you ate 4 apples a week, you bumped up to 8. But the bigger thing that I think would be beneficial is, as you mentioned, your youth not changing their behaviors. I don't know that we've been able to successfully do that. I know from a mobile market perspective, some of our marketing ploy or advertising campaign is actually donating the fruits and produce on a weekly basis to some of the programs. So we go into neighborhoods and communities where, if we're in Argentine, we go to the local housing project and donate it to youth. But it is one of those things that until you teach them ultimately the value of eating an apple versus eating the empty calories that go into a potato chip and the impact it has on their health, I don't know that you're going to change it. And if you're like me when you're a teen, I don't know if you're that really ready to listen. So it's one of those things where you just have to keep plugging along. I don't know that I have an answer. We do have facts that from our markets, we did increase the family's consumption. I'll add a caveat because I always tend to be very, very honest. If people were already shopping at the farmers markets, or they were coming there because they knew we had fresh local produce, they're already in the habit of eating healthy. We just made it more accessible so they could do it more often. So I will say that as well.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? Do they buy the chips in the school? Yeah. Okay. How do you fix that? You stop selling the crap food in the school. And I mean, I worked in Nevada in this issue for a number of years before I came to Kansas. And one of the biggest issues was how much money, I don't even know how to refer to them, snack food providers donated to schools for being able to have their machines in the schools. Well, at some point, we have to make a decision. You know, I mean, yeah, sure, kids will bring it in on their own. That's fine. But what are we doing if we're making bad food readily available to our kids in schools? What are we doing? Anyway, you just hit a hot button for me there.
Okay, and in the back.
To put any of you on the spot here politically, what do you think of Brownback and the more conservative House and Senate and the Kansas legislature? What sort of impact or result do you think that's having on the issue we're discussing tonight?
I have two kind of interesting polar responses to that. We were, as I said, Kansas hosted the University's Fighting World Hunger Summit the 2nd through the 4th of March. And Governor Brownback and Jerry Moran both wrote proclamations for us, which was really cool. And the other thing was that part of our activism of the summit was to contact them and let them know. I believe it was Pat Roberts who proposed the bill to cut SNAP benefits to 600,000 people. And so we did, based on the summit, a calling campaign. And they were hoping they'd have 40 people. And the day they chose for the calling campaign, 138 people called in. And I can tell you the staff members for Pat Roberts were not prepared for that at all. So I think that might be all I've got to say about that, really.
My wife works for Extension, and she is the statewide director for SNAP Ed. And so when she found out that Senator Roberts, they found actually the worst part of that was that one of her employees, actually in Topeka, saw the notice of that cut on Facebook and communicated that to my wife, who communicated that to the director of Extension at Kansas State University. And it caught everybody by surprise. There had been no notification that that was going on. And I know that there is a great, a whole variety of negative emotions around that. In terms of the rural grocery store piece, we have actually found that there is some synergy. If you all are aware of what's called the Rural Opportunity Zones, the RAWs, which is a thing that Governor Brownback has proposed, we have found some intersection of interests there, so that there are opportunities for people that are possibly looking to start a business in some of these rural counties, which fits sort of what we're trying to do. So, you know, on this particular issue, we don't. Well, most of what's happening is somewhat positive on the rural grocery piece, because it seems the governor and the legislature they're interested in supporting small businesses, and that's really sort of what we're about.
Obviously, my program that I work with lives and dies on the SNAP dollar. And this is a discussion we've been having long before this month. We started having this discussion actually in June and July of last year, to the point of the Food Policy Coalition. It's been something that we were raising to all of our constituents and our stakeholders in the metropolitan area. The biggest concern, and Deborah talked about it earlier, and this is, to answer your question, this is my personal, this isn't representative of my organization, but if we decrease things like SNAP, while I am a firm believer in supporting yourself and supporting your own family, working hard and doing that, if we decrease those and decrease the likelihood that a family is going to be able to provide food for their loved ones, there is going to be a natural occurrence. In the urban cores, you'll probably see increases in other things such as crime, et cetera. I'm a believer in that. I think that is natural. I think that this comes with the territory. I don't think it constituted or makes it worthwhile or allows it, but if they cut it, I think everybody's you're gonna see the food banks, they're gonna exhaust more quickly. We already see them all throughout the metropolitan area struggling to keep donations and their shelves full. Things like the churches that support families, they're gonna have a bigger burden as well. So it's a ripple effect. So if we don't support the rest of our culture, with that benefit for those that need it and deserve it, we're gonna support them in another way.
In fact, there is some research that I should have mentioned that indicates that SNAP actually keeps some census tracts out of being a food desert, because those dollars are enough to sustain grocery stores, farmers markets, so healthy food access. And if those dollars go away, then it's very likely that there will be an increase in food deserts, the very thing that we're talking about here tonight.
So I am putting our speakers on the spot here, but I gave them fair warning in advance that I wanted them to close us out tonight by giving us one suggestion of something that we could do when we leave here. So we have all this information. We don't all work with these great organizations, but what do we do, or can we think about doing when we walk out of here tonight? So I'll have them each offer a thought, and then I thank you all for coming and being part of the conversation.
So, okay, my whole deal is small town grocery stores. So what I would encourage you all to do, assuming that you all live in or nearby Wichita, is as you travel around the state of Kansas, don't always travel I-70, I-35, but instead travel the back highways. And and when you want something to eat or drink, instead of stopping at the local convenience store, stop at the local grocery store and purchase food from those grocery stores. I think that you would find that to be an interesting experience, and it would be beneficial to those stores.
Well, I thought long and hard. The first thing I'll say is most of us in the room probably either know the name of you know the name of your physician, maybe your mechanic, maybe the person at your dry cleaners, but how many of your food growers do you know? So my challenge to each of you would be to get to know one of your food providers. I can tell you right now, this past 3 years, my family has eaten food grown by Diane Spite, Dodge City Beef, which is down by Pratt, where they grow their cattle, Schenker Family Farms, which is down by Fort Scott, Tim Medford in Princeton, Missouri, and then John Good in Wathena, Kansas. So it is that simple. It is simple as going to a farmer's market. You're probably not going to catch it at your grocery store, but if you make a concerted effort, you can actually support your local economy and probably eat healthier on better food.
It's really hard for me to do one thing. So I guess I'm going to do one thing. The one that I'm going to hit is really similar to everyone else's, which is buy locally when you have the opportunity to do so. The line that keeps me going through all of this, through all of my work on hunger, is the idea that it only takes 1 grain of rice to tip the scale. You don't have to do all of it, but you can be 1 grain of rice. You can buy locally. You can donate to the Kansas Food Bank. You can engage in a food packaging event that Humana hosts. You can encourage your neighbors to build a local neighborhood garden. There are all kinds of individual steps that are appropriate to you and where you live that you can do to help make a difference in this issue.
Okay, so we have our charge. We're all going to go be grains of rice. Please help me in thanking these 3 for sharing with us tonight.